You are about to enter a story that defies the known limits of biology, psychology, and physics. A narrative so visceral that it strips away the veneer of the modern world to reveal the raw, ancient machinery of the human will to live. It begins on Friday, the 13th of October, 1972, a date that would become etched in history. A Fairchild FH-227D twin-turboprop aircraft, chartered by the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, was navigating the treacherous airspace of the Andes Mountains. On board were 45 souls, 5 crew members and 40 passengers, mostly young men in their early 20s, accompanied by friends and family. They were flying toward Santiago, Chile, for a match that was meant to be a celebration of their youth and vitality. They were dressed for a seaside vacation, light summer blazers, thin slacks, and loafers, completely unaware that they were hurtling toward a frozen hell that would demand a price no human should ever have to pay. The disaster began with a navigational error born of overconfidence and bad weather. The pilots, flying through heavy cloud cover and relying on dead reckoning, believed they had already cleared the treacherous peaks and crossed into Chilean airspace. They requested permission to descend, a fatal mistake. As the plane dipped below the cloud layer, the passengers didn't see the runway of Santiago. They saw the jagged, black face of an unnamed ridge rising up to meet them. The pilots applied maximum power, trying to pull the heavy aircraft up, but it was too late. The right wing struck the mountain and sheared off instantly, folding back and slicing off the tail section like a guillotine. 5 passengers and the steward were sucked out into the freezing void, still strapped to their seats. Moments later, the left wing was torn away. What remained of the fuselage was now a wingless, tailless metal missile, a projectile without guidance, hitting a steep glacier at 200 miles per hour. It sledded down the ice for nearly a mile, a terrifying toboggan ride of screaming metal and G-forces, until it slammed into a massive snowbank at 11,615 feet. The impact was so violent that the seats were ripped from their floor bolts and crushed forward like an accordion, trapping the passengers in a tangled mass of steel and bodies. When the screaming metal finally came to a halt, the silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying, broken only by the wind and the moans of the dying. The survivors found themselves stranded in a natural amphitheater of rock and ice, a place where the geography itself was designed to kill. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, causing the temperature to plummet rapidly toward 30 degrees below zero. The first night was a brutal lesson in the physics of survival. The fuselage had broken in half, leaving a gaping hole in the rear that acted as a wind tunnel for the freezing blizzard. The survivors, dazed, bleeding, and in shock, realized that if they didn't seal the plane, they would be frozen statues by morning. They became desperate architects. They dragged the heavy luggage, the smashed seats, and the debris to the open end of the plane, stacking them to build a crude wall against the wind. They used snow to pack the gaps between the suitcases, creating a primitive airlock. But inside, the metal floor was a sheet of ice. To survive that first night and the nights that followed, they had to reinvent the way human beings sleep. They created a human machine. They lay on the floor in a tangled, intimate mass, sharing every calorie of body heat. It was a strict, life-saving system where those with the warmest clothing or the most physical resilience slept on the freezing outer edges to shield the group, while the injured and weaker survivors were placed in the warm center. Every few hours they would rotate positions, slapping each other's faces and massaging frozen extremities to keep the blood circulating. The darkness was total, and the sound of the wind outside was deafening. For the survivors with compound fractures whose legs were broken and who screamed in agony at the slightest vibration, sleeping on the floor was impossible. In a stroke of engineering genius, the healthy survivors scavenged nylon webbing from the aircraft's cargo nets and built hammocks suspended from the ceiling pipes. This allowed the injured to float above the wet, freezing floor, saving them from the fatal onset of gangrene and hypothermia, though their moans of pain filled the dark fuselage every night, a haunting soundtrack to their existence. As the sun rose on the second day, the reality of their situation set in. They were trapped in a high-altitude desert. At 12,000 feet, the air is bone dry, and every breath expels moisture. The survivors were dehydrating rapidly, surrounded by millions of tons of frozen water they couldn't drink. Eating snow at that altitude is a fatal error. It burns the mucous membranes of the mouth until they bleed, cracks the lips into open sores, and lowers the body's core temperature so fast it accelerates death. They needed liquid water, but they had no fire and no fuel. They turned the wreckage into a solar water plant. They scavenged rectangular aluminum sheets from the back of the smashed seats, originally designed to hold meal trays, and bent them into shallow concave bowls. By placing a thin layer of snow on the metal and angling the sheets toward the midday sun, the aluminum conducted the solar heat, melting the snowdrop by single drop. These drops ran down into empty wine bottles found in the luggage. It was a maddeningly slow assembly line that required constant adjustment as the sun moved across the sky. One person was always assigned to water duty, staring at the metal, waiting for the precious liquid to accumulate. This invention produced enough water to keep 27 people alive, but it was never enough to quench their thirst fully. They also faced the blinding power of the sun. The UV radiation reflecting off the snow was burning their retinas, causing snow blindness, a condition that feels like having shards of glass rubbed into your eyes. The pain was debilitating, leaving men weeping and unable to open their eyelids. To fight this, they raided the pilot's cockpit, found the green-tinted plastic sun visors, and used a knife to cut them into the shape of goggles. Using electrical wire and bra straps found in the luggage, they fashioned wraparound sunglasses that saved their sight. They also discovered that lipstick found in a cosmetic case could be used to protect their lips from the blistering sun, painting their faces in surreal, clown-like masks to ward off the radiation. But the most relentless, unyielding adversary was starvation. The human body is a furnace. In extreme cold, it burns calories at a catastrophic rate just to maintain a heartbeat. A week passed, then 10 days. Their meager supplies, a few chocolate bars, some jam, and a few bottles of wine, were gone within 48 hours. There was no vegetation, no animals, not even a lichen on the rocks. They were starving to death, their bodies consuming their own muscle mass. They tried to eat strips of leather torn from the luggage, but the leather was chemically treated with tanning agents that burned their throats and offered no nutrition. They ripped open seat cushions hoping to find straw, but found only inedible nylon foam. They even tried to swallow small rocks to fool their stomachs. The realization came slowly, a dark, suffocating truth. The only source of organic matter, the only protein, and the only fuel on that mountain lay preserved in the snow outside, the bodies of their friends and family. It was a psychological barrier that no human wants to cross, a taboo woven into the soul of civilization. But hunger is a madness that overrides culture. The conversation began in whispers. They gathered in the crushed fuselage and debated theology, morality, and law. Some argued it was a sin. Others argued it was their duty to survive. They compared it to a heart transplant, using the dead to save the living. Finally, they made a sacred pact, a legal and moral agreement that if they died, the others had permission to use their bodies to survive. The first incision was the hardest. Using shards of glass from the cockpit windows as razors, a small group took on the terrible burden of cutting the meat. They dried it on the roof of the fuselage to make it easier to swallow. This wasn't savagery. It was a disciplined, heartbreaking act of communion. They established strict rules. Certain people were designated as cutters to shield the rest from the trauma of knowing exactly who they were eating. They ate to live, swallowing their tears with the frozen sustenance, fueling their bodies for a fight that seemed impossible to win. Just as they stabilized their grim new reality, nature struck again with overwhelming violence. On the night of October 29th, 17 days after the crash, while the survivors slept, a massive avalanche broke loose from the peaks above. It roared down the slope and slammed into the fuselage, burying it completely. The interior was instantly filled with concrete-hard snow to within inches of the ceiling. The silence was instantaneous and deadly. 8 people suffocated in their sleep, including the last remaining strong leader of the group, Marcelo Perez. The remaining 19 were trapped in a dark, airless tomb pressed against the ceiling, lying on top of the dead. The oxygen began to run out. The air grew stale and hot. In the pitch blackness, Nando Parado found a metal pole and, with a surge of adrenaline, poked it upward through the compacted snow. He poked and poked until miraculously he broke the surface, creating a small chimney that allowed a thin stream of fresh, freezing air to enter. They remained buried in that dark hole for 3 days, starving and freezing, forced to sleep on the bodies of the newly dead before they could dig a tunnel out. That experience hardened them. It stripped away their hope for a miracle and replaced it with a cold, iron resolve. When they finally dug their way out, they emerged into a furious blizzard, realizing that the mountain was not indifferent to them. It was actively trying to kill them. The final phase of their survival began with a crushing disappointment. They found a small transistor radio and rigged an antenna using electrical wire from the plane's circuits. Huddled around it, hoping to hear news of a rescue, they instead heard a broadcast from a Chilean station. The announcer stated clearly that the search for the Uruguayan aircraft had been officially called off, and that search crews would return in January to look for the bodies. The world had given up on them. They were ghosts. While many collapsed in despair, weeping for the lives they had lost, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa felt a cold resolve settle over them. Parado looked at his friend and said, "That's good news. It means we have to get out of here on our own." They realized that waiting was a death sentence. They began to prepare for an impossible expedition, walking out of the Andes. But to walk out, they needed to solve 2 problems. First, they needed to find a route. Second, they needed to survive the night in the open. They remembered that the tail section of the plane had broken off miles up the glacier. They organized a scouting expedition, hiking uphill in deep snow, a physical feat that left them gasping for air, their hearts hammering against their ribs. After hours of climbing, they found the tail. Inside, they found the plane's batteries. They came up with a plan to use the batteries to power the plane's radio and call for help. But the batteries were too heavy to move back to the fuselage, so they returned to the fuselage, dismantled the radio, and hauled it up to the tail. It was an exhausting, multi-day ordeal. When they finally connected the radio to the batteries, nothing happened. They had failed to understand that the plane's electrical system ran on AC power while the batteries produced DC. The radio was dead. The failure was crushing, but it forced them to accept that walking was the only option. While at the tail, they found something more valuable than the radio: the thick waterproof insulation material from the heating ducts. They dragged this material back to the fuselage. Scavenging copper wire from the electrical panels and using sewing needles they had found in a cosmetic kit, the survivors spent days acting as tailors. They sat in the freezing fuselage, stitching together a massive 3-person sleeping bag. This bag was their masterpiece, a mobile shelter that trapped their combined body heat. It was the piece of technology that would allow them to survive nights at 20 degrees below zero without shelter. They also selected the expeditionaries, Nando Pardo, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin. These men were given extra rations of food and were exempted from daily chores to build their strength. They were the champions of the group, carrying the weight of everyone's lives on their shoulders. On December 12th, exactly 2 months after the crash, the three men began the final climb. They were emaciated skeletons, wearing 3 layers of sweaters, trousers tied with electrical wire, and rugby shoes with absolutely no grip on the ice. They carried the sleeping bag, a supply of frozen meat stuffed into rugby socks, and a determination that bordered on madness. They faced a vertical wall of ice that would challenge professional mountaineers equipped with ice axes and crampons. They climbed slowly, taking 5 breaths for every single step, driving their frozen fingers into the ice to pull themselves up. It took them 3 agonizing days just to reach the summit of the nearest peak, Mount Sealer, which stood at over 15,000 feet. The air was so thin they were practically suffocating. Parado reached the top first. He expected to see the green valleys of Chile on the other side. He pulled himself over the ridge, looked west, and saw a nightmare. An endless horizon of jagged, snow-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no valleys, no green, just more death. Antonio Vicentin was sent back to the fuselage to save food supplies, leaving Parado and Canessa to go on alone. Canessa collapsed, convinced they were doomed. He sat in the snow, looking at the impossible distance. But Parado looked at the landscape, then at his friend, and made the choice that defined their survival. He pointed west and said, "Roberto, look. It's death there, or death here. I may die, but I will not die here. I will die walking west." He lifted his friend up and they began the descent into the unknown. They hiked for 10 days. They covered 38 miles of brutal terrain. They slid down glaciers, risking broken bones with every slide. They jumped crevasses that dropped into bottomless blue abysses. At night, they crawled into their homemade sleeping bag, their breath freezing on the fabric, praying they would wake up. As they descended, the landscape began to change. The white hell gave way to gray rock. Then they saw moss, then scrub brush. The air became thicker, richer with oxygen. They found a stream of liquid water, and then a miracle. They saw a lizard. It was the first living thing they had seen in 72 days. They stared at it in wonder. Finally, on the 10th day of their trek, they reached a rushing river. Across the water they saw a cow, and then a man on a horse. It was a Chilean named Sergio Catalan. They were too weak to shout over the roar of the river. They fell to their knees, waving their arms. The man threw a rock with a pen and paper tied to it across the river. Nando Parado, his hands trembling, wrote a note that has become legendary. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out quickly. We have no food. We are weak. When are you coming to get us? Please, we cannot walk anymore. Where are we?" He tied the note to the rock and threw it back. The man read it, signaled that he understood, and threw them a loaf of bread before riding off to get help. That loaf of bread was the first bread they had eaten in months. They ate it slowly, savoring the taste of life. The next day, the sound of helicopter rotors cut through the mountain air. The rescue had begun. The pilots of the rescue helicopters were terrified by the terrain. They couldn't believe anyone had survived up there. When they landed at the crash site, they found a scene that looked like a shipwreck from another planet. The survivors, emaciated, bearded, and sunburned, ran toward the helicopters, weeping. They were pulled from the grip of the Andes 72 days after they had vanished. Of the 45 who boarded the plane, only 16 returned home. They had lost their friends, their family, and their innocence, but they had kept their lives. They survived not because of a miracle, but because they refused to accept the reality that nature had imposed on them. They looked at a piece of aluminum and saw a water maker. They looked at a seat cushion and saw a hammock. They looked at the dead and saw life. They engineered their own salvation, proving that when stripped of everything, the human spirit is the most durable material on earth. This is the story of